In this video, we will learn how to use files in Node.js using promises. So what are promises? Promise-based operations return a promise that is fulfilled when the asynchronous operation is complete. So when that asynchronous operation like read a file, write a file, append, or any other asynchronous operation is complete, it will return a promise that is fulfilled. So what does this mean? So a JavaScript promise object can have three states: pending, fulfilled, rejected. So till the asynchronous function is not complete, its status is pending and the result is undefined. If it is fulfilled, the result is a value, and if it is rejected, which means there was some errors or there was a rejection of the promise, the result is an error object. So how do we use it? So let's say this is a promise, get promise, this returns a promise. Now when the promise is fulfilled, when that asynchronous operation is fulfilled, then it will go into the then. If the promise is fulfilled, if it is successfully fulfilled, and the result is the result we said it will give. So result is the value of it. And if there was an error, it will go into the catch and then we can handle the error. So this is the typical syntax for using a promise. Let's look at a couple of examples of how we can use it with files. So fs.promises. So the file module in Node, which is the fs module, has a framework for promises which comes in fs.promises. Dot read file. So we have given it the file name and the format in which we want to read it. Dot then. So when this file is completely read, then the content would have the contents of this file. And if there was an error reading this file, we will get an error which we can handle here. So this is the promise-based syntax. Let's try and use it and see it. So here, if I can say, let fs is equal to require fs, and we can say let fname is equal to say hello.txt. So now we said fs.promises.read file, fname comma say utf8. Now this will return a promise dot then. So instead of saying it, let's just for a minute first, let's say let content is equal to fs.promises.utf8. If we run this code, what do we get? We did not put a console.log. Let's do that. Console.log content. So if we run this code, what do we get? We get a promise which is pending. Because this is pending, this operation is still not complete. So we get a pending. So what should be the way to handle it? So instead of putting it like this, like we saw in the syntax, dot then. So when it is complete, it will go into the then and we will get the content or the result or whatever we want to call it. Let's call it say result. And we can now handle it. So we can define an arrow function. We can define any function to use it. Console.log result. We can do that. So let's run it now. And we get the text of this file. Now suppose this was an error. So this file did not exist. Now if I run it, I get a error here. So how can we handle that error? So like we did that, we can say dot catch error goes to say console.log error. So we read the file, then if we got a result, we handle the result. If we got an error, we handle the error. Let's run this code. And in this case, we get the error. We could have also said got an error here. And if we run that, that should be the text we get. So got an error. So this is how we typically define and use a promise. So this is the syntax fs.promises.read file. Then we handle the result, or catch, we handle the error. Let's look at another example. If we wanted to write a file, again, file name comma data to be written. So this will return a promise dot then. Now a write file does not return any result. So which is why we have handled it in the empty. So there are no parameters here. And we have just said anything we wanted to do. So note, it may or may not return a result, but if it is successfully fulfilled, which means if this operation was successful, it will go into the then, otherwise it will go into the catch. So that is given. So whether it returns one value or no value, it does not matter. And those are the two different cases we can handle. So let's look at a few exercises and let's use the file functions with the promise based approach and implement them. So let's start writing it. So let fs is equal to require fs. Now the first one we want to do, let's say we do stat. So function get stat file name. Now how do we get it? fs.promises.stat. So instead of calling fs.stat, we are now here calling fs.promises.stat file name. Now dot then. So in this case, if it comes to this then, that means we will get the content or the data, and let's log it. Console dot log the content. Otherwise we will just do a catch, error goes to console dot log. So that is what we have written. We have called this function. In the then we have processed the output. Otherwise if we got the error, it will go here. Let's run this code. Let f name is equal to hello.txt get stat f name. Let's run this code. So we get all the stats of it. Suppose we give a name which does not exist, then what do we get? We get the error message. So this is exactly how it was working. And here we have used arrow function. We could have just used a normal function also. So it is not necessary that we use arrow function. So we could have just done a normal function. And now if I run it, we get the same output. Now that we have done get stat, let's look at the others. Let's say function check access. It takes a file name. And let's also, like we did earlier, put a console.log stat comma file. Console.log access fs.promises.access file name dot then. Now in the then, this does not return a value. So what will it be? It's an empty, goes to, let's say, console.log. We used to say exists dot catch. Otherwise we will go to a catch. So what is the catch? Error goes to, and we will just say console.log does not exist. So this is what we have done here. Here there was no return value, so it's an empty. No parameters going to console.log exists, and if we get an error, does not exist. Let's run this code. So this file exists. Does not exist. So exactly the same way like we did earlier. So this is working fine. Next, what do we want to do? We want to do read a file. So let's just copy a code and edit it. So read file. So we will read this file. We will also need to pass a UTF-8. So this is the file we are reading. And then when we get the output, we will print the output. We can just say file content. Otherwise, we get an error. So let's test it now. Read file. Now in this case, this file does not exist. So what do we get? We get an error. If we go here, this file exists. We get the file content and we get all the contents. Now what do we want to do? We want to write to a file. So let's maybe write to a file. Write file f name comma the data to be written comma data, and in the then we don't want to do anything, so that also we can do. So we just do it, and if there is an error, we just console.log the error. So we can do that also. So let's do the write file f name comma let's say xyz xy. So we have written it to the file. Now if we read this file, what do we get? We get that these values have been read. So we are getting the correct output. Next, what do we want to do? We want to append to this file. So function append file. Again, append file does not return any value. So we have just append file f name comma let's say abc abc. Let's run this code, and now if we read this file, we can see that this content has been appended. So this is how we write it using promises. So this is a slightly different syntax, and this uses promises. Now what should we do? What we will do is we will just write some things to a file and read it multiple times and see what happens. So this is an asynchronous code. So we're calling read file, then we are writing to the file, then we are reading it again, then we are appending to the file, and then we are reading the file. Let's see what happens when we run it. So we're getting the read file, write file, read file, write file, read file, and then the file contents, which are the same. So why is this happening? Because this is asynchronous. So immediately after this, without waiting for that asynchronous function to return, this function returned and this went on. So in an asynchronous code, if we want to wait for each other, we will need to do it differently. So in the next exercise, we will see how to do that. So what does this exercise say? Take a text as input from the user, append the text to a file, and after appending the text, read the file and display all its contents. So we need to append it, and then after appending it, and that's important, read the file and display all its contents. Let fs equal to require fs. We will need read line to take input, so require read line sync. So in the previous video we had installed it, readline sync. If you have not installed it, just go ahead and install it. npm install readline sync. So just install it. It will help us read from the console. I have already installed it, so I'm not installing it again. Now let's read a text. Let text is equal to read line dot question. Enter the text to be appended to file. And let's say the file name is say hello.txt. Now what do we need to do? We need to first append it to the file. So we can just say fs.promises.append file fname comma text. So this is what we are doing. Now that we have appended it, then after appending it, what do we want to do? We need to do now fs.promises.read file fname comma utf8. After we have done it, what do we do? Then we would have gotten the data or the contents of this file. So content goes to console.log content dot catch. If we get an error, we will just console the error. So what are we saying? We did the append file. After the append file, if it was successful, it will come here, and if the append file there was an error, it would just have gone to the catch. Then we have read the file, and then we have printed the contents onto the console. Let's run this code. Read line is not defined. That's the error. Enter text to be appended to file. ASDFGH. So we get an undefined. Why are we getting an undefined in this case? So the reason is that here there was an empty that we got. So we should say it in this. So whenever this is the output that we got, and this goes to here. Let's run it again. And you can see last time also it got appended, but this code had given us an error. Why? Because we had written it just fs.promises. No, this is how we call the function. So this was the parameter. It had 0 parameter, so we should have called it in this way. Let's run it again. Say 1 2 3 4, and you can see we have appended it. So this is what we were supposed to do. Next, what does it say? Take a file name and text as input from the user. Check whether the file with the name exists. If it exists, display the contents of the file and then append the text to it. Otherwise, write it to a new file, and finally read the file and display all its contents. So the steps are: first, check whether the file exists. If it exists, display the contents, append the text, display the contents. Otherwise, write to file and display the contents. So let's go ahead and do it. So we also need the file name here. So we can just say fname is equal to readline dot question, enter name of file, and we delete it. So let us start writing the code now. fs.promises.access fname. Now then. So if it goes to then, means it was successful. So now in the then, what we can say is we can just either fs.read file fname comma txt fname comma utf8. Now after reading this file, then what can we say here? Content goes to, we display that content. So how do we display that content? Console.log before comma content. And after we have displayed the content, we can just say fs, and this should have been fs.promises.read file. So once we have read the file and displayed the content, fs.promises.append file. What do we want to append? fname, txt. And after we have appended it, then what are we saying? Goes to console.log append success, and then we need to read it again. So fs.promises.read file, fname, utf. So first we got the access of the file. If we got the access of the file, we read the file, displayed the contents, and now after we have gotten the promises, we can just say then content goes to console.log after comma. And what we can do is we can just have a common catch here. Error goes to console.log. So note here that this catch that we have given is within this call. So if this gave an error, that is not affected. So what are we saying here? We accessed it, then if it was successful, we called read file then the content that we got, we displayed it, and then we appended it, and in the then we called it. So this is how we have done it. So now if there was an error while accessing it, so what do we do? Catch error, and once we get the error, what do? We need to write it to the file. So fs.promises.write file. Now what do we write? fname, text. And once we have written it, then if it is successful, then what do we say? Console.log write success, and after the write success we need to read it. So how do we read it? fs.promises.read file, utf. Once we have read it, then content goes to console.log content, and we could have a catch here. Error goes to console.log. So let's recap this code again. So there are two cases when we have called this access. Either it will go to the then or it will go to the catch. If it goes to the then, which is this part of this code, then we have read the file. Then within the then we have called the content. We have displayed the content, the append file, and then the promises. If it goes to the catch, then we write it to file, and after the write is successful, we write success and then read the file and display all the contents. Otherwise, we just display the error. So let's now test this code. So let's say name of file is hello.txt, text to be added. Let's say k. So before this was the content, append was success, and after we got this content. Let's check for a case wherein the file name does not hello12.txt a. So we get a write success and then a. Let's do it again. hello12.txt b, and we get before, append, and success. So this is how we did it using promises. So let's look at the next exercise. Define 3 functions. Write the JSON data to a file. Take inputs and append data to JSON file, and read and display the contents of a JSON file. So we have a JSON file, and what do we need to do? Either we'll write the data, we'll take inputs, and we will append it to that JSON file. So we have a course. If we go and have a look at it, we have a course and students, and we can take the details of a new student and we will enroll that student, which means this JSON will get modified. So that is our function 2, and then the function 3 is to read and display the contents of the JSON file. Take the option of which function to execute from the user, and we will use the promise based approach to do it. So let's start doing it. So the first function let's define is function write say JSON. Now what will it do? It will write this course data into this file fname, which is data.json. Now to write it, this is an object. This is a JSON object, a JavaScript object. We will need to convert it into a string. So we can just say let data is equal to json.stringify course data. So what will this do? It will return a string representation of this JSON object. Once we have gotten it, we can just go ahead and write it to file. So we can just say fs.promises.write file, and what do we need to fname comma data, and then we can say then. In the then we don't get a result here, so we can just say console.log write success dot catch, and if we get an error we can just say console.log. So that's our code for this. So we write it, then standard that we have done so far, and otherwise we catch the error and log it. Next, what do we want to do? We want to enroll a new student. So let's define this function. Now what will we need to do? We will use readline sync to take the input of a user. So let's take it, say name is equal to readline dot question, enter name of student, let age is equal to read line dot question, enter age. So we have gotten these fields. Let's create a JSON. Let new student is equal to name is name and age is age. Once we have created the new student, what do we need to do? We will now need to modify this file. So for that, we will first need to read that file, convert the contents into a JSON object, push this student, the new student, in the students array, and then write this JSON file. So those are the steps. So let's first read it. So fs.promises.read file. What file? fname comma utf8. Once we have read it, dot then. So let's say data is what we get. So what do we do with that data? We will first need to convert an object. So let obj is equal to json dot parse. We parse this data. Once we parse this data, we will get the JSON object. Now what do we need to do in that JSON object? Obj dot students dot push, and what do we push? New student. Once we have pushed the new student, we have gotten the modified JSON object. We need to write it to file. So note, we will not use append here, we will use write. So we will write this object completely. So to write it, what do we need to do? We need to convert it into a string. So let data1 is equal to JSON dot stringify obj. So now we have gotten it, and we will now write it to the file. So fs.promises.write file f name comma data1, and we can say then, and we can just say console.log new student enrolled. And if we get an error, we can catch it. Error goes to console.log. So this is what we can do here. And if we get an error here, we can say dot catch error goes to console.log error. Next, what do we need to do? We need to read the file and print the contents. So read JSON fs.promises.read file f name comma utf8 dot then, and say we get data. Now what do we do with that data? We will convert it into, say, a JSON. First, let's console.log in string format so that we can see that data in string format. Let's now convert it into an object. JSON object is equal to JSON dot parse data, and once we have parsed it, let's console.log obj. This is what we do. Otherwise, if we get an error, catch error goes to console.log. So this is what we have done. So we have gotten our read JSON, our enroll new student, and the write JSON. Now what do we need to do? We need to take the option from the user and call that function. So let's do that. Let option is equal to read line dot question, enter option. 1 is write, 2 is enroll student, 3 is read. Switch, we will use a switch, say switch option. So if it is 1, then what do? We call the write JSON and then a break. If it is case 2, we call enroll new student followed by a break. And if it is case 3, we call read JSON followed by a break. So this is our code. Now let's test it if this works fine. So first let's write it. So write success. Now let's read that file. So if we look at the read in the string format, this is how this is written to the string, and this is the object converted. So if we had just used append, then whenever we enter a new student, we would have put it here. Now that format would not have worked. So which is why in this case we can't use append. We write the object again. Let's now test that. So let's enroll a new student, say Bob and 30. So new student has been enrolled. Let's read the file again. So we get that, and if you look at the format, see this JSON that we created has gone here. So we couldn't have just appended it here. So this is how we have used promises to solve this problem. So this is how we can use promises with files. It's a very powerful way and an easier way to use that callback functions.